Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malday, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, BPC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal Brown talks with Morris Levy, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts and Sciences. Professor Levy recently co-authored a study, Integration Policy Specifics and Public Support for Increasing Immigration, which explores how public support for increasing immigration can shift depending on the policy's design. The study focuses on how the addition of integration requirements helps sway opinions in favor of pro-immigration policy. So stay tuned.
Immigration continues to be a divisive issue across many countries, as right-wing populist parties in Europe have gained support on anti-immigrant sentiment, and President Trump won re-election in a campaign of mass deportation. Yet in the face of this polarization, new research suggests that the design of immigration policies plays a significant role in shaping public attitudes towards immigration and may create opportunities for less restrictive immigration reforms. In particular, the implementation of specific immigration integration policies in reform proposals can increase public support for those proposals. To help us explore this topic, Morris Levy, an associate professor of political science and international relations at the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts and Sciences, joins us. He recently co-authored a study that employed a series of survey experiments across 9 liberal democracies to investigate how different types of immigration policies elicit reactions in public opinion. The study examined how the design of immigration policy can influence public opinion, even among those who generally oppose immigration, revealing that even minimal integration requirements, such as employment and basic language proficiency, can increase support for pro-immigration policies. So we're really looking forward to talking through this, and welcome to the podcast, Professor.
Thanks so much.
Great to have you. So let's start out by just asking you sort of what was your motivation behind designing and executing this study? What were you looking for?
So I think that your introduction actually laid the groundwork pretty well for the motivation.
Yeah.
What we've been seeing in the last few years is that defenders of immigration, supporters of immigration, people who believe in its benefits are really kind of on their heels and on the defensive. And that's true not only in the US, but in Canada, which is historically a pretty pro-immigrant country and, the birthplace of multiculturalism. It's also very true throughout Western Europe. These countries have received a lot of immigration over the years. Asylum policy increased the numbers a lot. And we have seen, both in response to multiculturalism policies and to immigration itself, quite a lot of what you might call backlash in those places. So you have right-wing populist parties making inroads into electoral politics that would have been really shocking a couple of decades ago. They have really moved from the periphery to the mainstream in electoral politics, and have even been top vote getters or close in a lot of elections. And so the question on a practical level is, if you believe that immigration brings a lot of benefits to these societies, and I can say a bit about why I think you should believe that, then the question is, politically, what do you do in that situation? And how do you make headway in an environment where the public in general is kind of fed up with the situation, and that's being reflected in the electoral success of parties that are taking a pretty hard line, not just on illegal immigration, but often on legal immigration and asylum and all the rest of it. And just to elaborate a little bit on what I think the key issues are at stake, though there are others, these societies, including the United States, but certainly Western Europe, are all really aging and graying. We've heard a lot of talk about this in the current administration, which in the U.S., which has espoused, at least at times, a variety of what you might call pro-natalist policies to try to up birth rates and so on. The issue of aging is endemic throughout developed societies. It isn't something that we fully understand, and it isn't something that any society, I believe, has had a whole lot of success in reversing with any of these policy interventions, and it has a variety of effects. One of which is you get labor shortages. Another of which is that a lot of people might not want to live in a society where, with no disrespect meant to older folks, that the society is sort of all older people and you have no young around. And then there are severe problems for society's welfare states and social safety nets where, without having a young worker base, it's really, really hard, if not impossible, to fund those social programs where the need is increasing because people are aging into more need and the supply of people available to support them is going down. So those are some of the basic dynamics. People also have argued pretty persuasively that immigration is a key catalyst for innovation. These societies are facing heightened global competition from around the world, from China, and to keep up, right, you really need a sort of robust, younger workforce and a group of people who have the energy and ambition to innovate. On top of that, you could say that at least in the U.S. and Canada, and more arguably in Western Europe, immigration is part of our heritage. It's something that is consistent with the country's core values, our sense of who we are, and so that's something that a lot of us are worried about losing in the shuffle. And so the question that the studies were trying to address on a practical level is: can you make headway, and what sorts of things might politicians who want to advocate for keeping immigration levels high or even increasing them, what can they do to rally public support to the cause, or at least not to engender a backlash? And the particular interventions that we tested had to do with integration. By integration, we really mean kind of how immigrants become a part of the host society. And there are many, many dimensions to integration, and people value those differently. They give them different importance. The ones that we focused on primarily in these studies were two that we see as quite paramount in importance and rather consensual across societies. One of which being learning the dominant language, or in some countries, the official language, or one of the official languages, and the other being essentially becoming self sufficient financially, getting a job so that you're not dependent so much on the largesse of the state to support you. And so our driving question was, given that overwhelmingly in the abstract, people want less immigration, or at least no more, to use a phrase from the legal scholar Peter Schuck, is it possible to marshal support for immigration by reassuring people that the policies that would bring more immigrants also impose a set of reciprocal obligations on immigrants to join, to become part of, to integrate into the host society in these two ways? And in particular, these are things that most immigrants do in the United States, overwhelmingly so, in other countries to a very large degree. So we didn't think of them as sort of cumbersome or impossible or impractical requirements to impose and talk a lot about in the framing of policy. We instead wanted to see sort of if we applied minimal criteria to these policies and also challenged them with some counter arguments, would it be the case that support would increase? How much? Would it happen more in the United States and Canada, which have a lot of experience with immigration and tend to be more open to it? Would it carry over to European societies? That in a nutshell was the motivation.
Yeah. So can you name, you said there were 9 countries that you studied. Can you name those countries for our audience?
I hope so. The United States and Canada were the two in North America, and then in Europe, in the study that contained all 9, we had the UK, we had France, we had Germany, we had the Netherlands and Sweden, and we had Spain and Italy, which are a bit newer and not as prosperous destinations in Europe. So we tried to get some variation across European countries. I think that was 9.
So let me ask you, what surprised you most about when you finished the study? Was there anything surprising, and if so, what was it?
Yeah, I'd say two things were surprising. One was the magnitude and consistency of the effects that we found when we compared how. So, just to give you a little background, or your listeners a little background, in our control or baseline condition, we asked people whether they would support a policy to bring 50,000 additional immigrants a year to countries. And we either stipulated that the immigrants would be from European countries or from the Middle East. And we used the Middle East as sort of a hard case because we know that there's a lot of prejudice against Middle Eastern immigrants, a lot of stereotyping and stigma. And so if you can boost support for admitting immigrants from the Middle East in these societies, that's a good sign that you're on to something. Whereas it's maybe easier for people to accept European immigration. Okay, so that's the baseline. We didn't tell them much more at all about the policy, just here's an increase in immigration. And then in the other conditions that we ran, we gave people additional policy details. So either the policy would require the immigrants in question to learn the dominant language of the host society, or, and sometimes that's an and sometimes it's an or to get a job and demonstrate a level of self-sufficiency. We also in one study had a couple of stipulations about passing a background check and paying taxes, but that was only in one study, and it didn't seem to matter a whole lot as far as the results in the other studies. So the question was, right, how much more would people support the more detailed policy descriptions with the integration requirements than the baseline policy? And it turned out, and this was one of the surprises, it turned out monumentally more. So you had overwhelming opposition in every single country to the policy proposal, the bare policy proposal, the one that wasn't elaborated, to admit another 50,000 immigrants. That shouldn't be too surprising, given that when you just poll people on whether they want increases in immigration, it's rare for more than 20% of the public in any wealthy democracy to support more of it. You get some movement around, well, do you want to keep it the same or do you want to reduce it? Recently, we've been in a period where the reduced percentage has gotten quite high everywhere. But anyway, it shouldn't have been surprising that in the base case there was overwhelming opposition to the idea of increasing immigration by 50,000. But when we switched to the more elaborated policies, that flipped entirely. And what we saw, and this was true, and I'll get to this. This was true in every single country that we surveyed. What we found in the more elaborated, detailed policy proposal that talked about the integration requirements is that far more people supported the policy than opposed it. It wasn't always an outright majority. So you get a lot of things that were like high 40% supporting, but opposition to the policy would drop from majority to, maybe a quarter of the public, in some cases less, opposing these policies. And the rest sort of like, I don't know, it's okay with me, whatever you want to do in the middle, right? But that is, I mean, by the standards of
but decreasing opposition to a policy is a goal. You can't always increase support, but if you decrease the opposition, that does sort of help move the needle.
Absolutely. I think both are important. So these interventions did quite a bit increase support for the policies. In some ways, I actually think reducing the opposition is more important, in the sense that what politicians are up against right now is often characterized as a populist or anti-immigrant backlash. And so the question is, can you get to a point where you can pursue what I think and many policymakers think are good policies economically, culturally, and so on, without losing elections, essentially, without having this become a huge electoral liability for you. And at least when it comes to legal immigration and in policies that have these integration requirements appended to them, the answer seems to be yes. So the sheer size of the effects is fairly rare in survey experimental research. I mean, you think about it, like, people are often kind of breezing through these surveys, not necessarily reading carefully. These were administered over the internet. Plus, on immigration, we often have the impression that people are sort of locked in. These are deep-seated views, right? We have our national identities. We have our racial attitudes. The other is kind of a threat. Plus, the issue is really salient, and people are getting a heavy dosage of both favorable and unfavorable messaging. So how much latitude would there be to make people just say, oh, yeah, actually, I'm okay with this, policy to admit more immigrants? It turned out quite a lot, at least in our studies. And so that was one surprise. Another surprise was just the uniformity of effects across countries. We had gone in expecting that the US and Canada would be particularly receptive to arguments along these lines for reasons I can talk more about, but just in brief, because these are countries with a lot of experience with immigrants and less what you might call exclusionary political cultures. The United States considers itself a nation of immigrants. Canada has similar self designations. But it turned out that integration requirements, at least when we put language and work together, had very similar effects in all 9 countries. So that was somewhat unexpected. And then finally, I think a good way to describe this would be that regardless of whether we were asking about immigrants from the Middle East or Europe, the effects were quite similar. In other words, the plus of giving the information about integration requirements, it wasn't like it only worked for European immigrants where people said, no, okay, I can handle taking in more of these kinds of people. But in the Middle East, it would be harder to convince people. Instead, appending the integration requirements mattered about equally in both cases. There were, and I think we'll get to this a little later on. There were differences. I mean, the level of support for European immigrants was significantly higher overall than it was for Middle Eastern immigrants, but the effect of the additional policy details was very, very similar across both, and that's not something that would necessarily be anticipated by a lot of theories of immigration attitudes that focus a lot on the group origin and identity of the immigrants in question.
Let's dig into that a little bit more. So clearly, there are some inherent prejudices built into how people view immigrants based on where they're from. And I assume you saw some similarities in Canada, United States, and the European countries that preferred, if in your case, European to Middle Eastern immigrants just generically. But given that you saw sort of similar, at least percentage increases in support after you introduced these policies, it wasn't enough to sort of overcome that inherent distinction. So how do you kind of interpret that? Do you feel like it means that there's always going to be some anti-immigration sentiment, particularly for people from more stigmatized areas of the world, if you want to say that? And will that always be a drag, or do you think that there is still room to kind of work these issues from a policy perspective, even with more unfavorable groups?
Yeah, I mean, you might get the sneaking suspicion at some point during this discussion that I am a dyed-in-the-wool optimist, and that is sort of behind some of this research. So I think
People have accused me of that
forever.
too.
It's a chronic condition. So take this for what it's worth. That's my basic orientation. I think always is a long time. I wouldn't necessarily describe these prejudices as inherent in people, though I think you probably meant more inherent in the situation and the context, which I would
Mhm.
agree with. I think in the short run, I don't know exactly what the short run is, but in the present context, I don't see prejudice going away, and I do think prejudice is a major, important factor that we have to take stock of in understanding people's immigration attitudes. And in previous research, Matt Wright, my co-author, and I have found pretty consistently that the prejudice that people have against immigrants from the Middle East is particularly rigid. That may be because it is linked to particularly acute perceived threats in the sort of terrorism stereotype
Mhm.
that pervades a lot of the rhetoric, or it may also be an aspect of Christian nationalism is something that gets talked about in the United States, but the idea that Christianity, or maybe Judeo-Christianity, to take the sort of mid 20th century rendition of it, is an important part of the political culture, at least in some places. But anyway, whatever the exact reason, we have found that there's particularly intense and rigid prejudice against Middle Eastern immigrants in particular. I don't think that either the political context or the nature of prejudice itself and how it's learned easily admits correction and overcoming it in a short period of time. There are instances where that has happened. actually magnificent ones in U.S. history. The civil rights movement is one. The gay rights movement is another, where you just see these massive swings in public opinion. But those are rare, and they involve massive changes in context and political messaging that I don't think are that likely to prevail here. So it's perhaps a long way of saying, although I'm optimistic about the long run, and I don't think anything is forever. We've seen just numerous examples in American history of various kinds of nativism being really pronounced and then falling by the wayside. That's the long run. In the short run, I do think that anyone who's advocating for immigration is going to have to contend with prejudice and accept on some level that there are people you're not going to persuade. So, in these studies, you can say, well, we changed the balance of public opinion by referring to integration requirements. On the other hand, there are still 20-25% of people in these countries, and somewhat higher when it comes to Middle Eastern immigrants, that are opposed to admitting another 50,000 immigrants,
No
even
matter
even if
what.
you tell them, yeah, well, yeah, I mean, no matter what, like, at least given the requirements that we appended. Now, if you told them,
Right.
hey, they're going to buy a gold Trump visa or whatever it is for $5 million, or they're going to help us win the next, World War III, maybe, right? But
Or the next
yeah,
World Cup. What the heck?
or the next World Cup, sure, yeah, yeah.
So that's very interesting to me because, in the immigration, particularly immigration advocacy space over the last decade, there's been a lot of talk about narrative change. And there's some magical way that we can talk about immigrants that will change the public perception and narrative, like you said, about the major like civil rights or gay rights movements have done. And yet we haven't seen a lot of evidence about that. But you were promoting not just a message or a narrative around immigration, but you were promoting specific policies. Is it your sense that the policies matter more than the narrative, or they both matter?
I think they're intertwined. Perhaps that's a predictable response, but let me explain what I mean. So first, I should say I have a tremendous amount of respect for the kind of research that's been done on perspective taking, with some success, and I think what is sometimes described as various empathy based ideas. There's also a whole school of thought that says, that draws on something called contact theory, which says under certain conditions, and the conditions are really important and often not met, but under certain conditions, like equal status and positive norms and cooperation and so on, if you put groups together to work toward a joint task, prejudice is reduced, and there are some very famous and important cases of that, like integration of the U.S. military, where such effects were seen. So these are all approaches that I think are worthy of study. I would not be one to disparage these as kind of, I don't know, one weird trick type approaches. I do think, though, that if you look at the effect sizes and also the prospects that you have for making headway in a really polarized political environment, where any message is going to be countered with counter framing and counter messaging, and where there's a lot of disinformation, misinformation going around, I am a little bit skeptical of how well those interventions can work in the real world. They might do something important at the margin. I don't think they're going to be up to altering the basic dynamic. And so I think Matt and I are taking what we view as more of a realistic approach here, which is, look, to the advocates, you might have to take half a loaf here. We think it's more than half a loaf, but you're not simply going to get people, at least not anytime soon, to love immigrants, to change their minds wholesale, in a way that diffuses the basic dynamics of backlash here. And so what we're trying to do is say, look, you need to do two things. You need to craft policies that are real, that can survive the predictable counterattacks that people are going to make on them, and then you need to talk a lot about them. You can't. We don't think that it is viable to try to sell expansionary immigration policies in a way that neglects what are, to us, some of the key public concerns. You can say they're misplaced, about integration, either on ideological grounds or because, in fact, most immigrants do integrate in these ways. But the concerns are real. They're very easily activated by political messaging. And so you got to have policies that take these seriously. And then you've got to make sure that people are aware of those details, right? Because otherwise people are gonna revert back to what we found in our control or baseline condition, which is,
Mhm.
do I really need more immigrants in this place? It looks like they're everywhere, whatever. And I've heard all these questionable things about them. And so that's our point, is that it's both about the crafting of the policies and then the subsequent messaging that crafting policies in this way would enable.
Yeah. So maybe if I can summarize, it's not easy to change somebody's mind when you start out telling them they're wrong.
That
Is
is
that one?
true, and
Is that one way to say
it's
it?
yeah. I'm glad you asked that follow up. I think that's one dynamic. I also think there's a maybe a bit of nuance in what we're doing versus what the researchers that you're referring to are doing. We're not actually trying to change people's minds about immigration writ large. We're not
Okay.
even trying to make them feel better about immigrants. We wish they would. We are ourselves, quite pro immigrant for lots of reasons. It's kind of hard to live in Los Angeles and not love immigration. And the same is true for Vancouver, where Matt lives.
Mhm.
Uh, but that's not what we're trying to do. In fact, we are conceding on some level that people's abstract views about immigration are pretty hard to alter.
Mhm.
We're talking about, when we talk about immigrants or immigration, we're talking about a sort of mental construct that people have, or at least believe they have learned things about and heard things about for a very, very long time. And that evokes all kinds of group related imagery and ideas. And so it is hardly a blank slate, right? And then you're coming in and telling people, hey, actually, you should really feel bad for these folks. And then someone else comes in and say, you shouldn't feel bad for them. They're visiting destruction on the country and eating
Mhm.
pets or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Just to use a ridiculous example, but and so that's hard to dislodge those views. Whereas when we come in with a particular policy, what Matt and I are really saying is, yes, people have these sort of negative initial views about immigration, and yet they're not all encompassing enough that they prevent people from being pretty open minded about particular immigration policies. A different way of saying that is, people are somewhat uncertain and ambivalent when it comes to specific policies around immigration. Most people actually recognize that immigration brings a lot of benefits, even if they also see cost to it and don't want any more of it in the abstract. And most people also are not too sure about the balance of benefits and costs. And people recognize legitimate goals in policies that allow in a lot of immigration in these countries. And so what we're saying is, all right, instead of trying to convince you about something you've heard about all your life and maybe made up your mind about, or at least would revert to your prior opinion pretty quickly on, we're going to introduce something that's more like a blank slate. Here's a policy that you've never heard of. It's a proposal. It has to do with immigration. Okay, we know that triggers certain preconceptions and so on, but we're going to give you details of this policy. And then we're going to, mimic, at least in a rudimentary way, the kind of debate that you might hear about that policy. And we're going to see if we can get you to support that policy, even though overall you'd still, on balance, prefer less immigration, right? But you kind of make an exception in this case because the policy seems to be tailored to address your concerns.
Yeah. So that's very interesting. So thinking about politicians, advocates, how do you think they should incorporate these findings into their campaigns or into their work to try to appeal across these ideological lines?
Yeah, I think that the main takeaway from these studies, or at least the provisional takeaway, would be number one: do not, if you believe that immigration is a good thing, do not simply retreat. What we're observing is a sort of, what's the right word? It's an amorphous backlash against immigration. Various aspects of immigration, like what people perceive in the United States to be an out of control asylum policy, or an insecure border run amok. These things are sort of permeating people's attitudes about immigration generally. But politicians shouldn't conclude, let's say politicians who want to promote immigration, that doing this is simply categorically, inevitably unpopular or a political liability. They can advocate, and in fact, for reasons I can explain, I think they have to advocate a positive view on immigration and not simply run away from the issue. That's one takeaway, is that they can do that, and they can at least possibly do that successfully. Another more specific lesson is, okay, well, how do you do that? And our focus here is on legal admissions, legal immigration. It seems, based on our findings, that one can do this not only for immigrants that share a racial or ethnic origin with some of with the majority in the host society, but it can also be applied to groups that are historically stigmatized and not as central in the host society. But that one way at least to do that, is to amplify integration requirements, and that that you don't have to do stuff that is so obviously illiberal. That's perhaps a contested term, right? It's not that you need to get immigrants to give up their religion or change the way they dress or even necessarily root for a given team in the Olympics. There are interesting cross-national differences in how important people think those things are, but it is sufficient to draw on stuff that is pretty consensual, that if you poll immigrants themselves, 90% will tell you learning English in the United States, learning English is really important, and that it's important also, both for identity reasons and for very practical reasons. And you get similar dynamics on getting a job. So there's a question of how to do this. But I think actually the prior lesson is, and we hear this from so-called popularists sometimes in the United States. I'm thinking of people like Matt Iglesias and David Shore, both of whom I respect a lot. But my impression, and I hope I'm not taking them out of context or misrepresenting their view, is that, for example, Democrats have a lot of popular issues to talk about. Immigration is a lousy issue for them, period, and they should just not talk about it. I think our study is showing you can, and then to go a little bit beyond what our study can show, I don't think you really have that choice, because if you leave the terrain open on an issue, this is just,
It's not going
politics
away just
101.
because you don't
It's
talk
not
about it.
going away. It's not going away, and you're just letting Trump define you on that
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
And so he'll say, "Oh, you're open borders radical lunatics," or whatever. And you need to be able to not only say, "No, we're not that," but to say what you are actually in favor of. So
Yeah.
that's our view there.
So let's talk a little bit about differences between the countries. Obviously, we're very focused on what's happening here in the United States. Was there a difference in of the two integration things you proposed, the language and employment, in how voters in the United States or people in the United States saw the relative importance of those two things versus in other countries? I think it's worth noting in the United States, we've had quite a long history of having a debate about whether or not we should make English the official language. One of President Trump's hundreds of executive orders said that for the federal government, that it's a policy in the United States that English is the official language, even though it hasn't been legally made so. But there have been efforts to do that. There's and there have been pushback from many immigrant advocates to such a thing. But is that sort of more important here than in other countries, or less important here than other countries than the job question, or to what you put it, like not drawing on the social safety net, which also I think is an equally kind of regular debate we have in the United States?
Yeah. As far as language, the short answer, and you've probably noticed so far, I don't leave anything at a short answer, for better or worse. The short answer is, it is important everywhere to people that immigrants learn the language, very, very much so, but it is less important and less central in the United States than in the European countries that we surveyed. On the other hand, what seems to be more important to Americans is this kind of self-sufficiency norm. We didn't pick apart as carefully as we probably could in follow-up studies how much of that is getting a job and working hard, which is a sort of classic American value, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, Ben Franklin's almanac and all that stuff, sleeping 6 hours a night, and the Protestant work ethic and whatever else, versus the self-sufficiency side of not being dependent. Welfare carries a particularly acute stigma in the United States. there's a racial element to that for sure, but it also is embedded pretty deeply in the individualistic political culture here that goes way, way back. And so that aspect of it is more important. I'll just tell you a little bit about what we found in the third study that we did, which was on 5 of the countries. We took three of the European countries, the UK, France, and Germany, and we did Canada and the US. And in this study, instead of packaging together the language and work requirements for integration in the treatment, we did things 2 different ways. The baseline was about the same. The experiment was entirely on hypothetical Middle Eastern immigration. The baseline was the same as the first study. And then in one condition, we said, the policy requires that immigrants get a job, and elaborated a bit to say, experts think this will mean that they'll be self-sufficient, more or less. But we also included a counter argument that said, however, experts believe that that the immigrants in question may not blend in by learning the language, and in other cultural regards, dressing, interacting with others, and sort of blending in socially, this kind of social integration dimension. So there we pitted sort of a positive message, if you want to call it that, on economic integration and work and self-sufficiency against what would register with our respondents as a worrisome message on cultural integration. And then in the other condition, we flipped that. We said, this policy requires that they learn the language and demonstrate a certain level of sort of civic and cultural knowledge. On the other hand, there are concerns that the immigrants in question might not get jobs quickly, and they might become dependent on welfare in the country. And so what we found in this study, unlike in the second where the effects were all very similar when we packaged them, but in this study, the U.S. stood out, essentially, is what we found. Call it American exceptionalism in some sense. The U.S. was really different from the others. And so how is it different? Basically, the self-sufficiency, yes, cultural integration, no, policy frame was really appealing to Americans. I believe that opposition to that policy went down to like 16%, right? So, vanishing minority. And it was also, on balance, appealing to the European countries, but didn't move them that much. On the flip side, with the cultural integration versus we don't know if they'll get jobs kind of treatment, the European countries moved as much as the United States. And so the one that really stands out is when you give people some kind of reassurance about economic integration, but raise doubts about cultural integration. The US looks really different and much more positive than the other countries. Whereas when you give cultural reassurances, but call into question the self-sufficiency, the U.S. does not stand out, and so the European countries are more influenced, and the U.S. is somewhat less influenced. And why is that? I think it goes back to some really long-standing norms in the U.S. that are different from other places. The norm of self-sufficiency and hard work is probably stronger here and more central to our political culture. The other side of it, though, and I don't mean to sound like a jingoist here. These are things that I appreciate about America, but I'm stating them as much as possible in a neutral way. Is that we have quite a high level of cultural tolerance for cultural difference. You can find that in studies that go back quite a long way that ask either direct or indirect questions. And so when it comes to cultural integration, it's just less worrisome to more Americans that immigrants wouldn't immediately even learn the language, but certainly do things like, know a lot about the culture, blend in, interact with others. Those things are more important in the more culturally laden, you might say older nations of Europe than they are in the United States, which has always, in some sense, been a country that has diversity, even if it wasn't something that we talked about all the time, is really central to its identity.
Yeah, we are just more heterogeneous than many of these European countries in a lot of ways. So I think that's probably, well, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll ask a few more questions of Dr. Levy, so stick around. welcome back. We're here with Professor Morris Levy of USC Dornsife School talking about his study on policies that can increase support for more immigration. So we talked a little bit about this, and we talked about sort of the differences amongst the countries and the things that shape them. Do you think that the rise of populism, for example, in some of these European countries, which is, I think, maybe we started it and they're following, I can't really say for sure, but um, do you think that those have shaped sort of the responses, or do you think that the responses you got are maybe in spite of some of the rise of populism? I'm trying to figure out sort of the cause and effect here. Like, are these views and responses things you would have expected maybe before we saw some of the rise of this right-wing populism, or do you think it's kind of tied to where we are right now?
Yeah, I mean, as far as where it all began, I think we didn't start the fire, but we haven't exactly fought it. Um, Yeah, so I do think, I mean, one area where I think you see an effect of the current moment or period is in the baseline responses. And also to extrapolate beyond the survey, what they really mean. So it's a longstanding reality that that only a small minority of the public in any of these places wants to increase immigration. However, there was a period during the late 2010s, and basically in the U.S. this coincided with a kind of reaction, I think, to Trump policies. But we saw similar dynamics in Canada. There was a period during the 2010s where you actually saw quite sharp rises in abstract support for immigration. It had never before. So Gallup has run a time series on, would you prefer the level of immigration increased, decreased, or kept about the same? And this goes back to 1965, right? Basically the dawn of the contemporary American immigration regime. And, for most of this time period, the increase percentage was like in the single digits. And then gradually and haltingly, and with a bunch of reversals, we saw that rise, and it hit a peak of somewhere around 33 or 34% right toward the end of Trump's first term.
Yeah, it finally was more than the percent that see decrease, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
which was totally unheard of.
Not a majority, but a
No,
plurality.
a plurality, but you think about that, it's like more than a tripling
Yeah,
over
yeah,
time.
yeah.
And, so I think you had Professor Alex Kustov on a
Yeah,
few days ago.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
a few
he's
weeks
a
ago.
okay. Yeah, a few weeks ago anyway. Wonderful research on this topic, and he and I had gone back and forth on sort of what that meant, and I think he turned out to be more right than I was, that it had to do with what he thought of as a thermostatic reaction. On the other hand, I do think there's something real there in that younger generations have tended to become more supportive of immigration. But nevertheless, in the last few years, we have seen that number fall off a cliff, right? To the point that now it's still higher than it used to be, but it's like half of what it was, or less. And the number wanting a reduction increased a lot. This is not a totally sort of irrational response to a context in which you're getting a whole lot more immigrants, right? And politicians in both parties are sort of framing this as a problem. But it is a real change in the context. So had we done this study earlier on, had we done it 7 years ago, I think the baseline level of support for a policy to increase immigration might have been higher, and therefore the effects might have been more limited, although that's harder to say.
Mm-hmm.
We did in the United States, Matt and I did some studies for a book that we published in 2020 called Immigration and the American Ethos. This was all in the United States, where we looked in particular at hypothetical legal immigration from Mexico, and appended these kinds of requirements to a hypothetical policy, and also other stipulations about humanitarian need and family unity. And there we found similar effects to what we have here. A lot of opposition at baseline, though less than we find in the present study, I think because of the difference in the period. We found, though, that the requirements made a big difference, but we weren't sure going in whether that was a feature of just a more permissive and open period to immigration. The other thing, which goes beyond what one can establish in the survey, is that immigration is really salient what people mean or have in mind when they answer questions about immigration, both partisan dynamics and like which immigrants and what is it that immigration is doing for good or ill to the country, that changes a lot with context. And so you might think that in a more favorable environment where you have less of this kind of populist messaging dragging on this stuff, not only would baseline support be higher, but perhaps there'd be even more latitude to move people not only to a point where they're not opposed to the policy, but outright, hey, we support this because we understand the upside, or we think we understand the upside. I think the other major point that goes well beyond the survey is that there is an overall environment of low trust on immigration when it comes to establishment politicians. To some extent, that is richly deserved because, and I can go into why I think that if you'd like, but it's also a byproduct of just sustained withering attacks from right wing politicians who have told people for a long time they don't care about you. These are globalists. They're cosmopolitans. They are betraying the nation. They don't care what you want, and so on. Anyway, whatever the exact source of the distrust, it is definitely there. There are strong links between distrust in government and even the system and immigration attitudes that right wing parties in Europe and also Trumpism in the United States have really capitalized on. It's been a little less successful in Canada, but that was partly Trump's fault for messing up the conservatives in that election.
I was going to say, we could talk Canadian politics here. Just for our listeners' sake, the Conservatives in Canada were on track to have a landslide win in the next election until Trump started talking about it as a 51st state. And then Justin Trudeau stepped down from the Liberal Party, and that resulted in a pretty strong win for the Liberals, although not a majority in Canada. So
Yeah,
that's
they got
the in
close.
brief of what happened in
Yeah,
the Canadian elections.
that was pithier than I could have done, and exactly right. So yeah, they had their own conservative candidate who was sort of imitating some of this populist, mimicking some of the populist stuff on Trump. Yeah.
Yeah. But I should note that the new prime minister in Canada, who is a liberal from the same party as Trudeau, one of his first actions has been to decrease immigration to Canada. And he's talking a lot more about the concerns that Canadians had with immigration, particularly around housing, which was a big issue up there. So, it again, reshaping and talking about the concerns that Canadians had with immigration, lowering their targets, at least temporarily, is responding to some of those electoral pushes.
This is a great point and exactly right. And it's part of the reason that I say the main takeaway is, in brief, don't do that, or at least don't do all of that, or you don't have to do all of that, or at least after a brief period, you shouldn't have to do all of that. I think it's an overreaction. It was actually something that Trudeau had signaled the government
Yeah.
was going to do, and then his successor has moved to implement. It is pretty sweeping. It's not just illegal immigration. It's not just asylum. It's like students. It's
Students.
all kinds of categories of legal immigration. So it's not going to transform the landscape there, but it's a significant setback for advocates of mass immigration. And yeah, housing prices have been just a huge factor in the immigration politics there. So there are some distinctive features as well. But I don't think actually that kind of retreat, that kind of full blown retreat on every front in immigration, is necessary. I don't think it's a wise reaction on policy grounds, but that's not something that my own research is demonstrating. What we're trying to show is that there is a political capacity to be more specific in what you retreat from and what you continue to push on. And by the way, so it's not just Canada where this has happened. Trudeau outright apologized. This is very Canadian for the
Yeah.
for the immigration policies. We didn't see that in the U.S., but if you want to have some fun and you're a politics nerd like me, go online and download the Democratic Party's 2020 and 2024 immigration platforms. It is almost like the party went back 30 years or almost 30 years on immigration, to the Clinton era, when you had a lot of boasting about deportation numbers and all this stuff. it's really a remarkable shift. And so the Democrats are still advocating in some ways for increasing immigration by addressing backlogs in the visa system. But man, it is just appended with, whereas 2020 was all about like, it wasn't quite we want to open the borders, but it was all about basically permissive policy on every
Mm-hmm.
front and America's obligations on the humanitarian front. It is so clear the party was chastened by 2024 from comparing these platforms. And then you get the same in Europe, with both center right and center left moving to blunt these shocking rises of the far right.
Yeah.
You see people
The Labour
talking
Party
about
in the
the
UK.
the Labour Party in the UK, which is that, and also apparently toying with the idea of cutting welfare. I mean, who knew? But you get people. I think there was some discussion of this in an op-ed in the New York Times, but it's made the rounds that citing sort of Denmark as a model for social democratic parties, where they moved to sort of roll back their immigration support years ago, and therefore have had more success electorally and more ability to push for these progressive social policies that they want. But anyway, without getting into sort of the exact parameters of where the retreat had to happen and where it doesn't, what our studies are showing is that you can, without losing a tremendous amount of popularity, you can push policies that increase immigration, right? Not only sustain the status quo, but actually increase it, including from stigmatized regions of the world. And so a different approach would be more measured, right? On some things, you can't not control the border, right? You can't just
There's
assume
some
that everyone,
baseline things that you have to manage better.
you have to do it, and you can't realistically, like, people are going to get a clue eventually if you are enacting extremely lax or sweeping asylum policies, giving people protected status en masse without necessarily considering what the humanitarian circumstances are in these places. I'm sure that there are good arguments for all of these on policy grounds, and one can have a lot of sympathy, but there are practical limits to what you can do with immigration policy in any democracy. At least in the 21st century, these limits remain. So yeah, but on the point about trust, part of what's happened is that because there was overreach and because there was this backlash to it, trust in establishments is very low, and especially on this issue. And so in addition to pushing these policies, politicians are going to have to take some measures to shore up their credibility on this issue, because otherwise they're going to get pilloried
Hmm.
on the grounds that, why should we believe you that these integration requirements are serious, that you'll actually enforce them,
Yeah.
and so on.
Yeah. So, last question. If you were advising in the United States a bipartisan coalition of policymakers on designing immigration legislation, what is one sort of element that you say that you have to include based on your findings? And what would you tell them maybe you could leave that out?
Yeah, I think it would be very advisable, at least, to, if your goal is to promote a policy that's going to increase immigration levels, either it would be very advisable to include some credible requirements as they relate to integration, with clear benchmarks that can be referred to when inevitably an opponent says, "How do we know you're going to do this?" Uh, that is one thing. And if you're not going to do that, I think it's really incumbent on you to figure out what you are going to do to reassure people about concerns that they have learned over time and aren't simply going to have dispelled by, quote, experts telling them that they're wrong.
Hmm.
So I would recommend that. And then, as far as what I would not do at present, I would be really wary in the current environment. And again, as much as I think there is good research on this, good scholarship, and in a different environment, maybe it could have bigger effects. I would not emphasize in my platform policies that are geared to addressing humanitarian need, or to expanding the rights in the country, necessarily, of undocumented immigrants, or to expanding access, especially in the United States, to welfare. These are things that I think you don't necessarily need to cut back, but you need to show that you're serious about it. And in the current environment, whatever I think about the merits of these policies and the morals of the policies, politics is the art of the possible, and it's going to make it very easy for you to be painted as someone who is heedless
Hmm.
and ignoring the popular will.
Yeah. So thank you very much for that. Morris Levy, if people want to read this research for themselves, where can they find more information about this?
Oh, sure. So they can email me if they'd like at morrisl@usc.edu. But we've also posted a draft of the paper to the Social Science Research Network.
Okay.
So if you just search there for Morris Levy and Matthew Wright. um,
We will include a link to it in our show notes.
Oh, thank you.
Trust me.
Yeah, no, this if you want a skinnier version and not to wade through all the academic stuff, we have a piece in the Unpopulist, which is a Substack, and we describe the findings in more detail and get into some of the issues that you raised here, but not all of them.
Well, thank you so much for all of that download and for joining us on This Week in Immigration. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. Stay tuned for our next episode in 2 weeks. In the meantime, one last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan, and you can follow me at Jack Malday. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malday. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself, Theresa Cardinal Brown, Anna Lieb, and Tyler Quarry. Audio editing was by Josh Joe. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.